A country village, eerily empty, which hides a sad secret.
All of the citizens of this village have just been made to disappear at a stroke.
A mysterious tower, battered by the elements and scarred by war.
You're out here, really, the middle of nowhere.
A town ravaged, desolate and forgotten, decaying in the desert.
Why on earth would anyone choose to build a town in such a remote location?
And a disused railway deep beneath the streets of London.
There's actually a hidden system of tunnels that you don't get to see. They're there.
Once they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet, at the cutting edge of design and construction. Today, they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. But who built them and how? And why were they abandoned? On the southwest coast of England, almost 200 kilometers from London, is what looks like a normal English country village. But it's not.
The village pond looks like any other village pond in England, except there's no wildlife there. There are no ducks. It's eerily empty.
The feeling is very much as though all of the citizens of this village have just been made to disappear at a stroke.
Travel further in, and it gets even stranger. A few hundred yards from the village green is a school that looks perfectly preserved.
The desks are still there. The books are still there. It's laid out as if the children had only been there yesterday. There are still pegs with their names on out in the corridor. It feels as if it's a school that's still being used, but from another age.
You get the feeling that it's break time and the children have just gone through the door and are running about outside playing.
The village church, too, is in perfect condition. The pew seats seem freshly polished. And the stained glass windows are as immaculate as when they were first installed. And that's not all.
In the middle of the village, there's an old white telephone box, which seems something of an oddity in this day and age. And even more odd is the local story that even though it was disconnected decades ago, it still rings.
But other buildings hint at a darker past, such as the cottages, which are little more than empty shells.
And these are in an unusual state of disrepair. The roofs have gone, the fittings have gone, the windows have gone, but yet at the same time, these wrecks, these husks, have been strengthened.
It's almost as though somebody is about to film a movie about 1930s England.
Why on earth are these buildings like this? How can you have a little schoolroom that looks intact, a church that looks intact, but a lot of ruined cottages?
What could have happened to leave the village so completely abandoned? To find out what's behind the mystery, we need to go back to a single day that would change the course of the Second World War.
In 1943, Britain was at war. To win, the Allies had to invade France and liberate Northwest Europe from Nazi control.
The first phase was codenamed Operation Neptune, but it's known to history by its legendary name, D-Day. It was an enormous undertaking that would require unprecedented planning and training if it was to have any chance of success. The scale of the preparations certainly overwhelms the mind. Tens of thousands of troops found themselves billeted mainly in the south of England to be put through the intensive training they'd need to make the invasion. Very few of them knew when or where it would be made. They just knew it was coming.
It was a daunting prospect for the British Army. They had to train vast numbers of recruits, many of whom hadn't seen combat before, and they needed space and terrain and environments that were fitting and that were like what they were going to face when they arrived in France.
But what does all this have to do with a small and isolated village in rural England, a world away from the bullets and shells and chaos of war?
By 1943, the south coast of England had been transformed into an armed camp. 11 million acres, much of it farmland, became airfields, camps and training grounds.
And even more land was needed, particularly to train British and American tank crews.
If you're training people to operate tanks, it's not enough to just learn how to drive it. The really key thing is learning how to shoot it. So you need long distances to practice firing those shells where you're not going to hit anything you don't want to hit.
And this was the ideal location. It was remote and situated close to a firing range. It was the village of Tyneham.
The only stumbling block was that 200 people lived in the village. How do you tell them they need to leave their homes, their jobs, and their neighbors for good?
Linda Price, a local historian, has spoken to many former village residents.
The final blow came in November 1943, and totally out of the blue, they all got a letter. They came from a gentleman from Southern Command, and on it he said that the area was needed for military training, and they had basically a month to get out.
It must have been heartbreaking. These were people who lived in this village for generations, and all of a sudden to be uprooted and told that you have to leave, and they expected to come back. You know, that's what's very poignant about it. They thought the war would end, they would come back, and all would be as it was.
But why exactly did the Ministry of Defense choose Tyneham?
Tyneham was a backwater in a backwater. I mean, it was practically off the map. They didn't have electricity. Most of them didn't even have indoor plumbing. People forget how primitive the English countryside could be back in that era.
They lived in little cottages, most of which were owned by the landowner. In fact, the whole estate was owned by the Bond family, and most of these people, their lives would have been tied into the Bonds.
So in some senses, it was already a way of life that was passing, or perhaps for most people, even past.
So the inhabitants were simply ordered to leave by the British government. But why then is so much of the village destroyed, while other parts are almost perfectly preserved?
The army knew that the church was vulnerable to attack in the run-up to D-Day. They removed the heavy oak pulpit and the pews and carefully transported the stained glass to a place of safety.
Tyneham is now abandoned, although it hasn't been completely forgotten. The sacrifices of the villagers certainly helped the Allies make a vital step towards final victory.
The morning of the 6th of June 1944 was like no other the war had ever seen. Over 150,000 English, American, Canadian and other soldiers boarded ships, vessels, barges of all descriptions and attacked the French coast. By the time the battle there was over and the forces were able to push down into France, the course of the war had been changed forever.
D-Day was a resounding success, but the villagers weren't the only ones who'd made sacrifices. 2,500 US troops, many of whom had trained at Tyneham, lost their lives on Omaha Beach.
After the war, Tyneham continued to be used as a training ground for tank crews. And so the villagers were never allowed back. However, in these more peaceful times, the village is open to visitors.
When I look at Tyneham, what I think about is how much dislocation, how much destruction, what a human cost there is, even to winning a war, even to non-combatants. The level of self-sacrifice that was necessary to conduct the kind of total war that was required to defeat the Nazis, that kind of effort boggles the modern mind.
"27 kilometers west of Mackinac City, at the northern tip of Lake Michigan in the USA, is a peculiar tower-like structure.
Imagine a rock sticking out of a vast, cold lake.
You're out here, really, the middle of nowhere. And here, standing out in the water, is this odd, kind of half broken down structure that's kind of crumbling around the edges.
Sometimes dazzling sunshine reflects from the water onto the concrete and brick. But rubble and dead birds litter its interior.
It's made up of 3 sections, which each contain a mystery. What was enclosed in the caged top? And the height of the tower itself? Height always creates a vantage point, but for what? Attack? Defense? A warning?
Look closely, and a more perplexing picture emerges. On the walls are large, ominous-looking cracks. Inside, everything's been stripped out, apart from strange metal piping. And some say it is haunted by the ghost of a man who met a mysterious end.
The amount of damage on the tower suggests it's been weathered more than just harsh winters. And although the pitted base may well be from crashing waves, is there another reason why great chunks are missing?
When you look at a remote tower in the middle of nowhere in America, the last thing you expect to see is battle damage.
The roots of this strange story can be found in trade and its importance to the Great Lakes during the early 19th century.
Before America builds railways, America's arteries are waterways. The Great Lakes and the Great Canals are what enables America to become an industrial powerhouse.
The Great Lakes together form really a massive inland sea for the United States and Canada. And this waterway was important for shipping goods. So you had fur pelts, then later grain, iron ore, all these products moving through this area, dating from really, very early in the history of North America.
The Great Lakes connect the Midwest with the Atlantic Ocean. Measured by total area, they are the largest group of freshwater lakes on Earth. And by volume, they contain 21% of the world's surface fresh water. Their total surface area measures nearly 750,000 kilometers. The Great Lakes are noted for their extraordinary sea-like characteristics. Here, rolling waves, powerful winds, and strong currents are common. In fact, according to Chris West, who has sailed these waters for most of his life, they are more like inland seas.
You think of Lake Michigan, we can't see the other side. You can travel from Chicago, which is the southernmost point, to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and that's about 400 or 500 miles long, so it's a very big area of water.
However, at the Straits of Mackinac, it narrows dramatically. This is a major shipping lane which connects Lake Michigan to Lake Huron. But it is just 5.5 kilometers wide, with treacherous underwater currents which have often proved fatal.
If you're on a ship in the ocean and a storm comes up and blows you a few miles off course, you've got thousands of miles of ocean around you. But if that happens in Lake Michigan, it's relatively narrow. There's all these shallows. You could be on the rocks in just a few minutes.
In the Straits of Mackinac, there's over 80 shipwrecks. This was the most dangerous spot. They were coming up from Chicago, and they were making the corner to go into the Straits of Mackinac, and there was this spot that there was 4 feet of water, so these ships just kept running aground.
The US government decided it had to intervene to try and put a stop to the tragic accidents. This was how. The Waugashaunts Lighthouse. But how did they go about building a structure as impressive as this in the middle of such a huge lake?
You start with a wooden crib structure that rests on the bottom, and then you bring out rocks on barges and you fill this crib with rocks. Now you have a stable structure that you can build on top of.
It's a feat today to build something like that. And obviously back in the day, no power tools. It was nails and, big hammers and pulleys. And so it was very labor intensive to do something like that.
The lighthouse began operating in 1851.
It was a lifeline to all of the maritime traffic. This gave them their roadmap of how to get through the Straits of Mackinac. So it was hugely important for the area.
Its light, attended by a keeper and his assistant, was visible for miles around.
The lighthouse keeper's job was both incredibly boring and incredibly important at the same time. You had to keep that light working. You had to keep it going.
It was a pretty remote life. The light keepers would go out when the ice went out, which April-ish, they would be out there until November. And so they're there for essentially 7 months by themselves, not seeing another human.
The light was generated by an oil-burning lamp, which required constant attention and refueling. When the light was made invisible by mist and fog, a foghorn was used to warn ships. It was powered by steam, and it worked by emitting a low frequency warning through 2 huge metal pipes.
These are the stovepipes. They were for the fog signal for the lighthouse. They were in the fog signal building. You can still see the holes in the ceiling of the fog signal building where these went through. So down these steps brings you into the basement of the living quarters. And so down here, there would have been boilers, and there would have been supplies for the lighthouse keepers. Then first floor would have been a living room, a kitchen. Then you go up to the top floors, and that's where the bedrooms of the keepers would have been.
One of the Waugashaunts lighthouse keepers was a hard-drinking man called John Herman, a notorious practical joker. One night, Herman drunkenly locked his assistant into the lantern room. It was the last prank he ever played.
John had had a few,
and John decided he should lock the door on him. While all this was happening, a storm came up. Unfortunately, John fell off the side of the lighthouse. And ever since then, he's been the notorious John Herman of Waugoshant's lighthouse.
The assistant managed to escape, but John Herman had disappeared beneath the waters forever. Legend has it that his ghost now haunts the lighthouse. But what caused it to finally be abandoned?
As shipping through the Great Lakes began to become even heavier and the boats got bigger and they required a deeper draft, they rode lower in the water, that channel was no longer adequate. There was another channel farther out into the lake that was much deeper. So they built another lighthouse to mark that channel, and the Waugoshant's lighthouse became kind of obsolete.
In 1912, the last keepers left the lighthouse for good. But that wasn't the end of the story. Waugoshants would play an unlikely part in the development of a top-secret superweapon during World War II.
The US Navy starts to develop a remotely piloted aircraft, a drone that can drop bombs and sink Japanese warships. These early drones were piloted from another aircraft, and the operators were able to steer them using radio control, looking through early television cameras to see what that drone can see.
The project was top secret. It was called Stag 1.
They needed to practice. Guess what they picked? Our little lighthouse sitting out there. You know, it no longer was needed as a lighthouse, but it made a fantastic target. They bombed the hell out of it.
This is one of the remnants of the bombing run. You can see the amount of impact that it had because this is 1/4-inch thick boilerplate. And then you have about 2.5, 3 feet of brick used to come out to here, come out to where the boilerplate is right here. So when the bomb hit, pretty intense impact for it to be able to take 2.5 feet or 3 feet of brick and just kind of blow it out of there.
After the war ended, there was no further use for the lighthouse, and it was eventually completely abandoned for good. Today, it's home only to the ghost of John Herman, although there are plans to restore it.
So here's his lighthouse that stood there protecting the ships for so long, and then performed this important service during World War II. And let's not let it just crumble into the lake.
In the extreme northwest of Chile, close to its border with Peru, there is a strange, almost apocalyptic sight.
It looks almost like some kind of film set for an old Western movie. Everything's somewhat decayed, everything's rusty, but it's still standing, and in other ways it seems very much untouched.
There's something unnerving about the row after row of houses.
What's really strange is where the town's located. It's in the middle of the desert, miles away from anywhere. Why on earth would anyone choose to build a town in such a remote location?
There's a swimming pool, long ago emptied of water, with a diving board last used years ago, and a ghostly playground that will never again hear the sound of children's laughter.
Anytime you see a place that had been inhabited by humans, and then it looks as if they suddenly left, it gives you an unsettled feeling. It gives you a sense of dread. Maybe something terrible happened here.
But journey beyond the houses and the buildings suddenly change.
You see sort of rusted bits of machinery. There's clearly an engineering type of feel to it.
There's a rusted locomotive and tracks that lead to what looks like an old factory. Whatever happened here was clearly an extensive and complex industrial operation. But what was it?
What's even more confusing is that most of the machinery was made by British manufacturers. What was its function? And how has it ended up here in this remote part of Chile?
What you're seeing is the global economy drop down here into this remote desert. Why is it all here?
Clues lie in the population explosion that happened in the new industrial world towards the end of the 19th century, and in the need to feed huge numbers of people.
For thousands of years, farmers grew their crops using whatever nutrients were on hand. The manure from animals was collected, and that was good enough for a time. But in the 19th century, they started to discover that you could add additional chemicals to the soil and make your farms dramatically more productive.
Large deposits of a mineral that would revolutionize food production and transform the fortunes of Chile were discovered here in the Atacama Desert. The Atacama covers a 1,000-kilometer strip of land to the west of the Andes Mountains, and it's the driest desert in the world. Some areas have an almost otherworldly appearance, so much so that the soil has drawn comparisons with the surface of Mars. One 16th century traveler described the Atacama Desert as without men, where there is not a bird, nor a beast, nor a tree, nor any vegetation. The arid, barren landscape has barely changed over the centuries. However, one mineral was in plentiful supply.
This part of the Atacama Desert is rich in a mineral that then was called saltpeter. Saltpeter is a name for various forms of nitrate. And this is a chemical that essentially can work as fertilizer once you break it down.
And there's very few places on the planet where you can actually find this material, this particular type of mineral, in effect just lying on the ground, very, very easy to excavate and mine.
Saltpeter, then known as white gold, was in effect Chile's gold rush. It accounted for 80% of Chile's exports. The country's economy depended on it.
At the time, the northern part of Chile and southern part of Peru were actually the main provider of saltpeter to the whole of the world. Small mining villages were springing up all over the place to take advantage of this.
Humberstone was one of those villages. It's situated in that bleak desert, almost 1,500 kilometers from the Chilean capital of Santiago. And it was the center of the country's saltpeter production. But why does it have the very English-sounding name of Humberstone?
James Humberstone was an Englishman who arrived in this area in the late 19th century with a better way to process this saltpeter.
He took over the nitrate production facilities, and he did it so well that within a couple of years, he doubled the productivity.
Patricio Diaz Valencia is Director of Investigations at Humberstone and an expert on its history.
The people who used to work here came from different countries. They were Bolivian, they were Argentinian, they were Chilean. They all came together in this area and created a new society.
Humberstone was a company town, The 3,700 men, women, and children who lived there owned nothing, certainly not their houses or even their furniture. But these conditions were common in Chile, and violent workers' strikes were not unknown. Men in Humberstone were paid in tokens that could only be exchanged in the local general store. It was a harsh, tough life.
Tokens were paid according to the effort invested. There was a minimum. For example, in order to receive the minimum wage so they could live, they had to load at least 2 wagons every day. This took approximately 12 hours each day.
Digging for saltpeter was a grueling business. The workers were outside all day in the blistering sun with little water or shade.
They scrape up this powdery substance off the desert floor, crush it, boil it, and then they went through a series of processes that would separate out the valuable parts of these compounds from everything else.
All day long, crushers ground the nitrate-rich crust of the desert. That was then dissolved in boilers, forming a toxic soup of chemicals from which they'd eventually extract the nitrate.
Can you imagine what a brutal job this must have been, working in one of the hottest, driest places, boiling these nasty, chemicals all day?
The chimneys would have been bellowing black smoke, the boilers would have been seeping out hot steam, and the sheer danger of the work of mining was ever present.
So what caused the town to be abandoned? Was it because of an industrial disaster or some other calamitous event?
2 things killed Humberstone: war and technology. During World War I, the British blockaded the shipments of saltpeter from Chile going to Germany. And at the same time, German scientists developed synthetic ways of creating fertilizer, and so had no need to have saltpeter shipped from the other side of the planet.
The industry collapsed, and so that was the end of Humberstone. The houses and factories were abandoned, and the people simply upped and left the town. No one has lived or worked here for half a century.
The town's survival is a freak economic accident. After the last inhabitant left, it was sold to a developer, but he went bust before he was able to do anything with the town to strip out all the bits that he was going to sell. As a result, it's been preserved by the dry desert air and is now a United Nations World Heritage Site.
You can see exactly how these people lived. You see also how their fortunes were on the flick of a coin, because once the need for that mining left, they left. But they left everything in place.
In England, beneath the busy, bustling streets of London, lies a secret subterranean world.
There's actually a hidden system of tunnels that you don't get to see. They're there. What are they, and what were they used for? It looks like these things haven't been used for quite some time.
You've got stalactites hanging from the ceiling, you've got bits of water flowing along the bottom, and then there's water kind of dripping down the sides of the tunnel as well, so it's quite a spooky place to be.
It looks like a little hobbit railroad. The track is very narrow, only about 2 feet across. The ceilings are very low. So it's really kind of mysterious. Who made these little miniaturized tunnels?
These twisting tracks, stretching far into the distance, provide clues.
As you move around the tunnels, you suddenly come into open spaces, actual stations. So there are stations in these tunnel networks.
Away from the stations, there are more signs of activity, but from long ago.
There's empty filing cabinets, there's desks with old broken telephones on it. When you see overalls draped over things, telephones, kiosks, everything, it's almost as though this place was abandoned fairly quickly. It seems like there wasn't enough time to remove everything and clear out when you left.
If it was an area that was more accessible, scavengers would have come in, people might have come in and taken stuff, you'd see graffiti, but because these tunnels were really quite deep, they really did not get picked over or stripped.
What was it? Who worked here? And why has it been left abandoned? In the early 20th century, most people communicated by letter. Smooth delivery of mail was critical, particularly to London, the country's financial hub.
So if you have a legal contractor, you have a policy, you have a negotiation, being able to move those documents around the city quickly was part of the key to London's economic dominance.
It could take several hours to deliver mail from one part of the city to another. Something had to be done to speed things up. But that was easier said than done. By the end of the Edwardian era, the population of London had risen to almost 7 million people. 1 in every 5 Britons lived in the city. The fact was that the streets of London were becoming more and more crowded. Although this teeming metropolis was still blighted by grinding poverty, this was a time of tremendous economic growth for the city, and the mail system had to play its part. In 1909, a committee was set up to look into ways of solving the problem.
If you think about the streets of London back then, they were really busy. There were horse carriages and animals and all sorts of things happening up at street level. So to find somewhere where they could very quickly and efficiently move really important documents around, they had to go underground.
And this was the result. An underground rail track stretching 10 kilometers across London, the Mail Rail. It was a revolutionary piece of engineering. But the constructors faced many problems and challenges.
London is really built on a big swamp, an estuary. And so, as a result, when you start digging underground, it's very damp, muddy, sandy, silty.
And they in fact encountered one of the largest subterranean rivers in the area called the Fleet River. And so water ingressing into the tunnels was a big problem during engineering.
Ray Middlesworth, one of the last engineers here, is well aware of the dangers they faced.
There were incidences when they were digging the tunnels and many workers had to run for their lives to get away from the water bursting through.
But ways had to be found to complete this vital project.
One of the things they did was to add airlocks, and then they pushed air into those sections of tunnel to keep the water out. They also used floodgates in portions of the tunnel, so if water did come in, they could isolate those sections of tunnel which were full of water and then quickly pump the water out.
In 1927, the Mail Rail was finally ready for service. It was the only one of its kind in the world.
These trains do not have drivers, they don't have engineers. So it's really the first driverless electric vehicle system in the world.
The system meant they could speed mail right across London, avoiding the congestion on the streets above.
The new track connected Paddington in the west with Whitechapel Station in the east and linked up 6 other sorting offices along the way. A conveyor belt linked the tunnels to the mainline platforms at Liverpool Street and Paddington. Ray remembers trying to keep the system working smoothly while processing up to 4 million letters a day.
You had to work under a lot of time pressure because once the train stopped, they would start backing away all the way around the system, and the whole rail network would grind to a halt. This is battery loco number 2, nicknamed the Banana because of its bright yellow colour scheme. We used to use these locos when the railway was shut down to retrieve broken down trains and do maintenance work on the track in the weekends. This was built in 1927. It's still serviceable. Sturdy beast, built by English Electric, weighs 7.5 tonnes. And I must have jumped in and out of that cab about 1,000 times during my career.
Although the engineers somehow kept the mail rail running, the threat of flooding was ever present.
This is one of the 4 floodgates installed to seal off the main tunnel from the station in case there was a deadly flood and we needed to pump the water out. It was mechanical in operation, so that it could be relied to operate in any circumstances. Very sturdy.
The mail rail ran beneath the streets of central London until 2003. Why is it now deserted? By the beginning of the 21st century, the mail rail had simply become too expensive to run.
It was delivering mail around London for some 80-odd years. And its demise, well, we had the internet age. We were no longer sending so many letters. There was also a much better infrastructure above ground, so it really lost its economic importance.
On the last day of service, I was one of the engineers on duty that day, and it was my job to shut down the power at Mount Pleasant. It was historic, we had a job to do, but we all knew what it meant. It was coming to the end of an era after 76 years. Very sad.
Today, part of the track still lives on as a tourist ride and museum.
I think that that's just fantastic to preserve that really important legacy.
And the real beauty of the Royal Mail underground delivery system was that it was happening with many people being completely unaware that it was there. We didn't really know that letters were actually moving beneath our feet.
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were at the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes from history in these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.